Welcome, everybody, and good afternoon. I'm Susan Bryson, the director of the Susan and James Wright Center for the Study of Computation and Just Communities, and I am thrilled to welcome you to our inaugural event and to introduce today's speaker. As I posted on social media a few hours ago, with an embarrassing number of exclamation points, Ruha Benjamin's in town, and she's going to give a talk at Dartmouth at 3:30. And I'm so excited. If I were any more excited, I would burst. I would like to start by thanking Sally and William H. Newcomb, class of '64, for gifting Dartmouth with this new center dedicated to advancing equitable democratic societies through the study of computational techniques and innovations. And I am delighted that they chose to name it after two people they and so many of us love and admire, Susan de Beauvois Wright and James Wright, Dartmouth's 16th president. As we await the inauguration this Friday of Dartmouth's 19th president, Sian Beilock, we continue to mourn the loss of Jim Wright, who passed away last October. But we are so very fortunate to have Susan Wright's continued dynamic presence on campus, including here at today's talk. I want to thank you, Susan. Thank you for being a transformational leader and a cherished mentor to countless students, faculty, and staff at Dartmouth for the past 45 years. And I'd also like to thank Dan Rockmore, director of the Newcomb Institute for Computational Science, and finally, Christine Ellen and Casey Hess, manager and administrative assistant for both the Wright Center and the Newcomb Institute, for their invaluable work planning and hosting this event. When I assumed the position as inaugural director of the Wright Center this summer, I already knew who I wanted to be the first visitor to Dartmouth. In fact, I'd been trying to bring her here since 2019, but the pandemic kept thwarting my plan. An enthralling storyteller, brilliant scholar, and fierce advocate for all things just, Dr. Ruha Benjamin is a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, where she studies the social dimensions of science, medicine, and technology, with a focus on the relationships between innovation and inequity, knowledge and power, race and citizenship, and health and justice. As the founding director of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab, she brings together students, educators, activists, and artists to rethink and retool data for justice. Dr. Benjamin is the author of, among other books, Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code, and most recently, Viral Justice, How We Grow the World We Want, born out of the twin plagues of COVID-19 and police violence. At the center of all of Dr. Benjamin's work is an invitation to, and I quote, imagine and craft the worlds we cannot live without, just as we dismantle the ones we cannot live within. Her talk today is entitled Utopia, Dystopia, or Ustopia, Reckoning with the Future of Technology and Society. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruha Benjamin.
Testing, 1, 2. Can you hear me? Awesome, good to see you. Thank you for coming in person. Thanks for those who might be streaming. I'm thrilled to be here. It's right that we have been trying to make this happen for years. And so I'm just energized and excited to be here. I also want to just shout out someone who's very special to me, my Spelman sister, who's a professor here, Professor Kwayana. Can you just wave your hand? Theater professor, who, that's the icing on the cake for me, is that I get to be reunited. And so let's just see who's in the room for a second before we dive in terms of, let's just start with departments or centers. If I just point to this side of the room, just shout out like your major or your program or department. Right here.
Computer science.
Louder. Right here. Wonderful. Okay, so we have such a great mix. How many seniors in the room? Juniors, sophomores, first years. Woo, let's give it up for them. This is like probably one of their first lectures of this sort, so I kudos to you for making time. Graduate students, all right, awesome. And then faculty, you count, staff, you count, I love you. All right, so let's dig in. I want to start by offering you some of the ways that I think about this nexus of society and technology, and then make time for moving from the problem space to thinking about how different people, organizations, movements, artists are tackling this problem space. And so if you can stick with me till the end, hopefully you'll be satisfied with just getting a glimpse of all of the different ways that people are addressing the problem. If you have to leave early, it's okay. You can ask your friends what I talked about. So let's start with a line that is a touchstone for me. Not all speed is movement. Tony Cade Bambara. So I apply this to so many areas of my life when it comes to what all the things we're racing after. But here I want us to think about technological speed. What do we have to race past in order to beat competitors, to get that latest thing to market? And I juxtapose these images, one from a prior era of racial oppression, and one from the beginning of the pandemic. When we think about educational inequalities, the pandemic photo is taken of students who are protesting in the UK when the government used an algorithm to grade their A-level exams, rather because they couldn't sit for them. And predictably, schools with more working class populations, more students of color, their grades were predicted as lower. And so students took to the streets. And one of the posters that you see when you look up these images that I think is really insightful is it talks about the way that their zip codes are predicting their test scores, which reminds us that these technologies are not creating something new, a new set of problems. They're reflecting, scaling up, often hiding pre-existing forms of stratification and inequality. In this case, segregation that we can see according to zip codes. We know that very well in the US through practices like redlining and racial covenants. And so what I want us to get to think about when it comes to technology, it's not just the impacts of these tools that we need to be concerned about, but the inputs. What is going into them that's creating this feedback loop? And so we have to widen the frame and start the story and the analysis much earlier than we often are led to believe. And so thinking with this idea, not all speed is movement, I want to suggest that there are two main stories that we tell and are told about this relationship between technology and society. The first on your left is what we might call the techno-dystopian narrative, right? That technology is going to slay us. It's going to take all the jobs. It's going to help students cheat. It's going to slay humanity. And of course, this is the story that Hollywood loves to sell us in the form of the Terminator, the Matrix, the list goes on. The other is what we might call the techno-utopian narrative, that technology is going to save us. It's going to make everything more efficient, more fair, more convenient. It's going to help us bypass human bias. And of course, until recently, this was the story that Silicon Valley loved to sell us. And while these seem like opposing narratives, right? They have different endings, one in which we're harmed, one in which we're helped. They actually share an underlying logic, what we would call a techno-deterministic logic. Fancy way of saying that we assume technology's in the driver's seat. It's impacting us. But the human inputs, the values, the ideologies, the desires even, that are encoded into our systems are missing from both of those scripts. And so one of the first things that we have to do to reimagine and reckon with this relationship is to pull back the screen and to look at who are the human agents and agencies that are encoding the world that the rest of us have to navigate. One way to think about it is this, and we're going to circle back around to this at the very end, so just keep it in mind, that in many ways we're living inside someone else's imagination. Their imagination of what is good, what is free, what is success, the list goes on. And so one of the first things we have to begin to do to explode or expand, democratize, if you will, who and what gets a say in the world that all of us inhabit, is to, one, question this dominant imaginary that we're navigating, suffocating within, and then begin to seed and proliferate and carve out intellectual and creative space to imagine otherwise, to conceive other ways of relating with our physical digital realities. So I think it's easier to pull back the screen and question technology in hindsight when we look to the past. I'm going to give you a few examples of this, and what I'm going to suggest is we have to take that capacity and apply it to our present, the things right under our noses that we're being sold. So Exhibit A. We know that the company IBM had a hand in the atrocities of the Nazi regime, providing the tools and technologies, the ways of collecting the data that were a precursor to mass genocide. It's what one author calls a bureaucracy of evil. Because although we associate these past harms with a few bad boogeymen, it actually required an entire village, an entire bureaucracy to execute. People just doing their jobs, just clocking in and out, not asking too many hard questions, putting their head down. And so for me, the question becomes, what are the bureaucracies of evil that are taking shape today? In what ways are we asked to just put our head down, not ask any questions, not be a troublemaker? And what does that allow? What does that facilitate? And so moving from, let's say, the past, what we could call deadly data, to the present, thinking about what we might call do-gooding data, where the stated goal is to help people, to help communities, just communities. One example for you to get us thinking critically beyond these buzzwords, Community Innovation Project, takes us to St. Paul, Minnesota, where a few years ago, the police department joined forces with the public school system in order to create risk assessments of youth in the city, essentially predicting which young people would be future criminals. High, medium, low risk. When members of the community got wind of this, they said, first of all of the places where you're going to get this data, to create this data sharing platform and these risk scores, none of these institutions have worked in the best interests of our young people. Suspension records, attendance records, whether kids are involved with child protective services, where they have family members in jail or prison. And so they said, we're not buying this with these buzzwords, and we're not going to assume this is going to turn out well. Furthermore, labeling young people risk is another form of stigmatization. Why not, like sociologist Victor Rios, gang member turned professor, why don't we label them at promise? Name what we want. And so over a course of a year, this community, they met together in town hall meetings, focus groups, and eventually not only did they put an end to the Community Innovation Project, but they said, give us the resources that you're about to pour into this data sharing platform. Let us decide what is in the best interests of our community. Let us have a say, right? And so they were at once critical, but also creative. They were not just saying what they didn't want, they were articulating what they wanted and ready to execute that and work on that, which is, again, this twofold capacity that I think we have to hone and develop in our pedagogy, in our organizing. And so, again, I want to provide one, it won't be the last, let's say the second historical detour to get us thinking, how can we apply those insights to our present? 1957, Mechanics Illustrated magazine. The robots are coming. When they do, you'll command a host of push-button servants. Goes on to say, and I blew it up for you, in 1863, Abe Lincoln freed the slaves, but by 1965, slavery will be back. Don't be alarmed. We mean robot slaves. A whole lot going on here, right? You could spend the whole class period unpacking, close reading. I'm just going to point out a couple things before moving on. One is just to linger for a moment on this year, 1957. What's happening in the social milieu, in the context in which these technologies are being dreamt up? Specifically when it comes to labor and domestic labor. Who are the groups that are usually doing this for free or for cheap? In what ways are they beginning to push back? And so it gives rise to the need or the demand for so-called robot servants. But the other thing is even closer. Put this under a microscope. We'll all have personal slaves again. That one little word tells us who this technology is for. Certainly not those who are the descendants of people who were enslaved the first time. So within that one little word, it gives us a sense of who this technology is for, the interlocking systems of race, gender, class that are shaping its circulation. And so we don't just analyze the technology, we peel back and we say, what are the inputs, the desires, the needs, the demands that are giving rise to it, but then what are the outputs? Who is it for? Who is it excluding? Who is the imagined beneficiary, user of this tool? So any analysis has to widen the frame and not just focus narrowly on the stated purpose of the tool itself. And so to think through this, for me anyway, it helps to bring in, again, the imagination, to think speculatively. I just finished teaching a class yesterday called Black Mirror, Race, Technology, and Justice, which uses the television show as a jumping off point to think speculatively about the tools that are killing us, but also the ones we can develop that are life-affirming, that get us closer to just communities. So in that spirit, I'm going to share a 3-minute clip from a film probably most of you haven't seen called Sleep Dealers, to get us thinking about this nexus of race, class, labor, migration, and so forth. And we'll come back around to it in just a second.
3 minutes long. In this scene, you'll see the character as he crosses the border for the first time. So you see he's in Mexico, but he comes to America in a new way.
Cerca de la colonia donde vivía, en las afueras de la ciudad, estaban las infomaquinas, los sleep dealers.
Este es el sueño americano. Le damos a los Estados Unidos lo que siempre han querido. Todo el trabajo, sin los trabajadores. José está en un matadero en Iowa y María es niñera de una niñita en Washington. Ustedes tres van a estar en una chambota en San Diego. Muchacho, enchúfate. Tu futuro empieza hoy.
Español.
Choose your language.
So in this world, migrant workers are replaced by robots who are controlled virtually by laborers in Mexico, carrying out a variety of jobs in childcare and agriculture and construction and more. Not only is the tech invasive, as we just saw, but it allows unprecedented surveillance. So if a worker falls asleep for an instant, the computer wakes her up, registers the lapse, and docks her pay. Amazon warehouses on steroids. In this way, the film reminds us how the fantasy of some, on the other side of the border, is the nightmare of others. And that embodiment doesn't cease to matter when it comes to automation, but it can actually become more intensified, intrusive, and violent. It's worth recalling the etymology of the Czech word robot. It's drawn from the Slav robota, which means servitude, hardship. So as anthropologist Kathleen Richardson observes, robots have historically been a way to talk about dehumanization. As one report puts it, while we've been watching the horizon for self-driving trucks, the robots arrived in the form of the supervisor, the manager, the foreman. And that last 3 seconds for me is really instructive. Choose your language. Because it also reminds us that diversity and inclusion is not a straightforward good. That we can be included into harmful systems. Plantations were diverse, but yet domination was the order of the day. And so a concept that I think is useful when we think about technology and other systems is predatory inclusion. That we shouldn't just assume including communities into various schemes, initiatives, projects is in their best interests or what they want or going to serve the greater good. And so let's move forward. 2022, I believe, Super Bowl. The most popular ad in the Super Bowl that year was this Alexa ad, in which the woman shown here goes to the store and the shopkeepers tell her, Alexa can be anything you want. She looks out the window, she sees a bus go by with Michael B. Jordan advertising his latest movie. And she's like, oh yeah, okay. Alexa is gonna be Michael B. Jordan, sexy black Alexa. And so as the commercial evolves, it becomes funnier and funnier because as you see here, he's reading to her an Audible in the bathtub and her significant other's on the other side of the door like, what's happening in there? Really smart, funny commercial. Is this progress when it comes to inclusive design and technology? Well, we need some context. Part of that context is thinking this is Super Bowl 2022. What else is happening around this time with respect to not just Alexa, but Amazon? Well, just so happens that majority Black and Latinx, this is 2021, so I have my year wrong, not a Super Bowl watcher. They're starting to unionize, right? And so think about the fact that this ad that's showing this really appealing black face of technology is happening at the same time when behind the scenes, the same company is trying to squash this organizing drive. And so if you ask the actual black women in the warehouses what is inclusive design, what is inclusive technology, would they say sexy black Alexa? Or would they have something to say about their work conditions? They're breaking our bodies. Yeah, there's high turnover rate, but why is that? Because they're breaking us, they're literally breaking us. And so part of what we have to do when it comes to this language of DEI is move beyond the cosmetic forms of inclusion to the substantive changes in the conditions that people have to live and work in. When we think about this relationship between race and technology, we can't be satisfied with a cute ad, common rapping about AI, for example, which is a thing, and not look behind the screen. Thinking about this juxtaposition of convenience and care, right? Our convenience, often relies on not caring about those conditions. The fact that I can open my phone right now, and before the end of this talk, I can have a steaming hot bowl of ramen waiting for me outside the auditorium. What does that rely on in terms of the everyday conditions that produces that convenience? And so my invitation is for us to, again, look beneath the surface, beyond the buzzwords, the shiny exterior of these systems, and think carefully about what is producing it, what are the determinants. And I think to do that, we have to understand what's distorting our ability to read reality. Racism and other interlocking systems that are distorting our sense of why these patterns continue to exist, right? Rather than feigning surprise and shock. Oh my gosh, the technology is biased. Oh my gosh, the algorithms are reproducing discrimination. And actually understand that that was predictable if we understood the larger context, and that this is a global phenomenon, not confined to the US, when we think about these distortions, whether it's our neighbors to the north and the way that indigenous people are treated there, people of color are treated, whether it's places like France that swears it's colorblind, doesn't want to count race so that it magically disappears, looking at the way that Muslims are treated there, again, the way North Africans are treated. Whether it is the place of my birth, India, they're looking at caste hierarchies, religious discrimination. This is a global phenomenon. Even places that we assume are homogenous, like Japan, where my sister-in-law lives, looking carefully at the way that Japanese of Korean descent are treated like second-class citizens. Housing discrimination, educational discrimination. And so thinking it's global, but it's also specific. The analysis of the way that technology is reflecting these hierarchies has to be specific to the history and the society in which it's taking shape. I can't impose my analysis on others. There are scholars and organizers in all of these places that are doing this work that we can support and highlight. And so I want to offer now, as we transition to think about, what people are doing about this, an analog example, because I think part of my job as an educator is to empower you to share this with others, including like the kindergartners in your family, the 5-year-olds, like it has to start earlier and earlier. So here's an example that I think can be related beyond the halls of academia. This bench is in Berkeley, California, which is where I went to graduate school. I took this photo in February. I was working at BU at the time. And I wanted to just lay in the sun for a few minutes between meetings to soak in my vitamin D, and realized quickly I couldn't lay down comfortably because of the way it's designed. And while there are all kinds of reasons we could think of, functional, putting your elbows down, whether you're elderly, when I was 9 months pregnant, getting up and down, perhaps a stranger sitting on one end, you might be more willing to sit because of that invisible air wall, my mind went to probably what many of you are thinking, that it prohibits people from sleeping on the bench, people who are unwanted in public spaces. After all, there's some cute little antique stores right in front of here. My favorite flea market is around the corner. And so I did a little digging, and I found, in fact, it's a global phenomenon, what architects call hostile architecture. I found single occupancy benches in Helsinki, only one booty at a time, no laying down there. I found caged benches in France. The mayor installed these on Christmas Eve, and within 24 hours, the people in the town rallied together to have them removed, which reminds us we don't just have to submit or click submit. But my favorite example, and I could geek out about benches for an hour, I won't spare you, is the metered bench that actually has spikes built into the design. You put some coins in, spikes retreat for about 15, 20 minutes, so don't get lost in your favorite Harry Potter book. But you'll be relieved to know that this was originally created by a German artist to get us to think critically about questions of design, about public space, about the metering of social life more broadly, about how things can be nominally for everyone, but because of the way we've designed it, we have these built-in harms and exclusions. So applying the bench metaphor and thinking about what are the spikes, what are the forms of discriminatory design in our work, in our classrooms, in our neighborhoods, structured into the everyday so that it doesn't necessarily jump out at us as a form of exclusion and harm. Though I will say, if you can't pay, then you notice it. That is, if you can't navigate the hostile environment, you're more likely to have insight into it. But if it was designed for you, you often don't notice the harms, the encoded inequity. And so just stick with me for a second. So let's think with the bench. Thinking about the obvious spikes and the insidious spikes. Because again, I'm trying to get us to grow our capacity to see beneath the surface, to see the things that aren't so obvious. Obvious. Bench from South Africa, whites only, in our face. Right? We know who's wanted, who's not wanted. We can see it coming. And many of us assume if it's not like this, it's not really a big deal. Right? But in fact, the more insidious forms of harm, where the surface looks very inviting, welcoming, inclusive, and yet the underlying structure is the same. You get there and the same forms of harm and exclusion persist, right? And so our job is to actually be able to read beneath the surface and to see what's actually going on here in the design of this thing, whether we're talking about an automated decision system or a classroom, a syllabus. And so thinking beyond the obvious, I'm going to juxtapose some examples just to build that muscle. Thinking about racism in policing. Here's an image from North Miami PD. This is the photos that they were using as target practice before they hit the streets. So no wonder that often these are the same bodies that receive the brunt of police violence. The only reason we have this is because the sister of one of these young men was in the National Guard, went to the shooting range, saw her brother's photo in the trash with a bullet hole through the middle, and brought it to the media's attention. Footnote to this story that I want you to sort of ruminate on is that when this happened, people just didn't observe quietly. Many people started to get together, including clergy, specifically white clergy in Miami, got together and created the hashtag "Use Me Instead," and put their own faces there in order to call out the harm and hypocrisy associated with this everyday form of anti-Blackness that they understood was connected to the more extreme, spectacular versions that often get the headlines and the hashtags. And so thinking about insidious ways that this takes place, people will say, well, if we know we have this bias in policing, let's throw some technology into it. That can help us fix it. It's more objective, it's more neutral. And yet we know, whether it's predictive policing, software, or facial recognition, that it's reflecting and reinforcing these pre-existing forms of inequality, including people being falsely accused of crimes because of the way it works. So it's not a quick fix just to throw technology in as a solution. Moving from policing to preschool. Some colleagues down at Yale put eye-tracking technology on preschool teachers and asked them to look at the kids playing and said, look for the challenging behavior. The vast majority of teachers' attention went to the little black kids in the playgroup, even though they were behaving the same way as all the other kids. They were higher child actors instructed on how to behave. And so whether we see it in adulthood with police or in childhood with preschool teachers, this everyday form of obvious harm and discrimination persists in our institutions. So let's throw some technology into the mix. Hundreds of universities and colleges have adopted student success predictor scores. Remember those risk predictors back in St. Paul? Well, they're already operating throughout our higher ed system. And through one of the first audits of this, through the markup, we know that black students are being deemed higher risk as much as quadruple the rate. And specifically black students in STEM fields, high risk in terms of not graduating. And so this is being done to help them, we're told. But you could imagine a school advisor, a counselor, having a student come in, they pull up their profile and that high risk pops up. It gives them an excuse, a reason to steer them out of that major. Not because they personally think they can't handle it, but because the computer says it. And so in my view, if we're going to use these type of tools, why not point them in the other direction, at the people that are producing the risk? Why don't we rate departments? Why don't we rate fields? Why are we pointing them at the most vulnerable in these institutions that are trying to navigate? Because oftentimes those in positions of power don't want to be tracked, don't want to be assessed. And so that's where we have to think about the power dynamics involved, even though the do-gooding ethos is what surrounds this. Last example, last set of examples, let's move to healthcare, right? Where we have social science data piled to the sky, showing that whether it's medical students, physicians, attendees, residents, in many different forms, this everyday form of anti-Blackness persists, and of course, other forms of discrimination as well. Specifically in the context of pain, where Black patients' pain is undertreated. And so let's throw some technology into that. If we know that exists, let's bypass that with some algorithms. And we know, again, through one of the first audits of a widely used healthcare algorithm, that Black patients were routinely pushed out of programs where they would have gotten more attention and more care. Obermeyer and colleagues published this, their report in Science. And so I'm thinking about this historically, and thinking about my grandmother's generation going up to the hospital and seeing that whites only sign. The spike was in her face, right? Now I can walk through the front door, and there very well may be a healthcare algorithm making decisions about my care, creating the same pattern of resource allocation, but I don't even know about it. And this is why I term it the new Jim Code, to invoke that history of Jim Crow discrimination and to get us to think about how it's being amplified in our current tech-mediated context. Innovation that produces containment. And so now I think this is the last historical detour. And here I really want to say two things. One is that oftentimes when we're presented with example after example, there starts to grow a sense of inevitability about these things. Like, this is just the way humans are. This is going to be with us forever. It disempowers us to do anything. And so for me, it's helpful to think historically, because then we can see the contingencies. We can see how we actually made decisions that got us to this place, and we can make other decisions. The second reason for this detour is that I want us to think about the role of science and scientists in creating this problem. Imagine us standing within this racist architecture. Oftentimes we attribute racism to ignorance. It's the people who don't know. It's in the backwoods, right? Very classist idea that, it's the hillbillies that are the problem. No. This ideology was produced in the citadels of learning by people like French naturalist, renowned scientist of his day, Georges Cuvier. He and his colleagues helped to erect this ideology that we still live with. And so I say this because if science and scientists were so pivotal in creating the problem, we're also responsible for addressing it. It's not something that's outside of our realm, apolitical, asocial, right? We have to deal with this. And so what did Cuvier have to say? The white race with oval face, straight hair and nose, to which the civilized people of Europe belong, and which appear to us the most beautiful of all, is also superior to others by its genius, courage, activity, to which, of course, he compared the Negro race, marked by black complexion, crest of woolly hair, flat nose, the projection of the lower parts of the face, evidently proximate to the monkey tribe, the hordes of which it consists have always remained in the most complete state of barbarism. So much going on here. We would spend a whole semester. We'll spend 2 minutes. Cuvier, what is he doing? He's not just talking in the abstract, these vague generalizations, white superiority, black inferiority. He's mapping these onto something concrete, namely the human body. Why? Why go through all the trouble publishing article after article, measuring every single part of the black body to produce signs of inferiority? If it's so obvious and self-evident, why do you have to go through so much work? Well, the more that he and other scientific racist architects could get us to think of these differences as fixed, concrete, natural, immutable, God-given, the less likely we are to question them, much less try to change them. And so the durability of race and this distorted way of seeing each other and the world is directly tied to us believing that it's evident in biology. And so one of the first things we can all do yesterday is to denaturalize these associations that are not just about more beautiful and ugly bodies, but are mapped all to personality traits, character traits. The last thing I'll say is that oftentimes when we're presented with these historical examples of racism, we often feel like that's kind of unfair for us in our modern sensibilities to impose our values and our views on the past. Cuvier was a man of his time. We can't judge him. But of course, there were people in Cuvier's own time that were already questioning and refuting him, including his own student, one Frederick Tiedemann, who initially went to go sit at the feet of Cuvier, learn from him, and then started to think carefully and critically about what his teacher was producing. And he began to publish his own refutations, not only tackling the scientific fallacy, but the racial bigotry associated with it, which reminds us, one, that there's a parallel history. Yes, scientific racism we've inherited, but there's this parallel history of scientific anti-racism, another genealogy that we have to learn about so that we can build upon. This is also our legacy. And it's a reminder that students should question their teachers. Just because it's published doesn't mean it's true. And so Tiedemann provides us an example, a model of how to do this in Cuvier's own time. So coming back to the present, why we're here, AI, machine learning, deep learning, I want to suggest that computational depth without social and historical depth is actually superficial learning, in the sense that it reads the surface. And what we have to do is begin to go deeper, think about these patterns, these inputs, which is why we need a room like this and a center like this that brings us into conversation where we can learn from each other. But that sounds very kumbaya, because in fact, our universities have hierarchies of knowledge, where we can even be around the same table, but some people's voices and insights carry greater weight than others. So again, you can have diversity, but you can still have hierarchy. So as we build this center and think critically about this, we have to always ask ourselves, what is the power dynamics of what's happening here? Because it intersects with knowledge hierarchies. We need all of these insights, but let's pay attention to whose insights often has the last word. So now what? In the last few minutes, I want to tease you with some of the ways that individuals, groups, movements are addressing the sets of issues that I laid out. And you can pick up on any of these threads and we can go a little deeper into what this looks like, how it relates to your work. Noting that I'm going to skim the surface, just as I told you we need to go deep, all right? So the first thing, of course, we think, well, if it's such a big issue, it's impacting everything, we really need policy change, right? Of course we do. So whether that is thinking about the algorithmic accountability bill that was introduced 2 years ago, year and a half ago, whether it's the blueprint for a digital AI Bill of Rights, whether it's the EU's Artificial Intelligence Act, all of these things are trying to address the larger ecosystem, not individual technologies, but the context in which these tools are being produced. And we need you, young people, some subset of you, to really go into this field and think about this tech policy arena. It's not my specialty. I put it there as important, but not my specialty. Because I tend to be really interested in the bottom-up types of changes that are, I'm not gonna see the fruits of in my lifetime, but that's where I tend to put my energy. And so the next set of examples is getting us to think about things we can all do yesterday that can begin to contribute to this transformation. Of course, there are things that technologists are already doing that we can grow and foster. Whether it's things like the Data Nutrition Project, where they've taken like the nutrition labels on foods and applied it to data sets. And to say, we need to know what's in these things. We need to think about, you know, what is poisoning us in terms of data and what is life affirming. And so this project is something I encourage you to go, again, all of these things, bookmark, go look up. Building consentful tech is another important arena in which, again, people are already working on to think about what does it look like, both from the point of view of a user, that we should know, for example, when we're engaging with synthetic text or not, but also on the back end where we think about whose work is being used to train all of these models. And so building consentful tech is interesting because it applies the same rubric that we use for sexual consent, the FRIES acronym, freely given, reversible, informed, specific, enthusiastic, and it thinks about how it could be relevant in the context of technological consent. Then there are things that, like the audit studies that I've mentioned so far, the ways in which they're learning from and adapting to this context, building in this historical analysis. One quick example for you. Remember that idea of pain treatment that I mentioned? Well, these researchers said, if we know that doctors are routinely underestimating the pain of some patients, what if we trained the AI not on the doctor's reports of pain, but on the patient's self-reports of pain? And turns out it's more accurate and less biased. So here's a group of researchers that are saying, let's build the social and historical insight into our work and change where we go looking for the knowledge and the expertise. A wonderful example of thinking interdisciplinarily around this. We look at the way that organizers in tech, people working in these technology companies, are not putting their heads down. They're asking hard questions, they're working together. They're drawing lines and saying, we won't create that system that you hired us to do. If you want some insight into this, go to the hashtag #TechWon'tBuildIt to see what kind of organizing is happening around this. And it's important to note that the conditions, the labor protections inside of these tech companies is directly tied to their individuals' ability to be whistleblowers, to be able to call out the harms when they see them. Otherwise, they get pushed out, they get fired, and there's retaliation. And so that's why organizing in unions like Google's Alphabet Workers Union and others is so important as protections against that. Not just white-collar tech workers, but people in the warehouses, people on the ground that are part of the tech workforce. We have to see them as such. They're also not sitting idly by. Going back to St. Paul, Minnesota, a few years ago on Prime Day, the workers there organized a strike because of the terrible work conditions. They had to pee in bags, they didn't have breaks, they were sick, they were getting fired, they couldn't take sick leave. But what's also important is that white-collar workers from Seattle came down to stand with them in solidarity. And so thinking across racial and class lines, what does this look like? And note the sign, we are not robots, reminding us how these figures are routinely a stand-in for questions of dehumanization. Pedagogy, which is like my sandbox, thinking about how we have to train the next generation of not just technologists, but humanists, social scientists. What does racial literacy look like in tech? This is a handbook you can download for free, developed by the Data and Society Research Institute in New York. The goal of this is threefold. Develop an intellectual understanding of how structural racism operates in algorithms, social media platforms, and technologies not yet developed. And emotional intelligence concerning how to resolve racially stressful situations within organizations, and a commitment to take action to reduce harms to communities of color. Again, this is a very slim handbook that is like a rabbit hole. You can dig deeper using the bibliography. Noting on that last point that those communities are not standing idly by waiting for us to save them. They're organizing themselves, whether it's in Detroit, the Detroit Community Technology Project, the Immigrant Defense Project, Data for Black Lives, the Algorithmic Justice League, and the list goes on. Many places and locales are already thinking about this intersection between the justice concerns that they were already working on and how tech is mediating this. And again, this is global. Whether we think about what's happening in Brazil, on your left, India, top right, Palestine, bottom right, many countries and regions are building up this tech justice movement and organizations. And so students have a huge role to play. This is not something you start worrying about once you graduate and you're looking for a job. Use your power as students, because these same companies are trying to recruit you, are competing for you, are trying to make themselves seem like the most progressive workplace. And students are using that to call out many of these practices, whether it's lending technologies for ICE raids, whether it's surveilling Black communities. They're drawing the line, saying, we're not going to even interview with you. We're going to, put you on our blacklist. And so thinking about the role of students, I wanted to shine a light on two of the students in the Just Data Lab, Kania and Peyton, who were profiled in this Boston Review piece. Again, this is a bookmark. Definitely go visit this to learn about how, as the headline says, a new generation is tackling this. And I'm sure that there are students here that are already engaged in this kind of work. And so thinking about the lab again, one of the things we've tried to do, thinking historically, is to build on the freedom school movement of the civil rights era and say, what does it look like to have tech freedom schools today? Using our summertime to learn, to organize, to collaborate with community organizations around this. And so you can see here some of the elements of our approach is really learning from the past, adapting it to our current context, and then having this combo of critical and creative approaches to this, not just the critique alone. And so again, I want to kind of underscore the fact that the conversation we're having here is part of a much longer trajectory. The issues are not inaugurated by these latest tech companies. Here you have MLK already warning that we have guided missiles and misguided men. He says, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Again, a reminder for us that this is something we're building on. This is a much longer freedom struggle. Then tech has a role to play, but it's not the center of attention. And so I want to end now with, again, a last short video. I promised you we'll come back to art and imagination. Here's an example that we might think of. Remember, I showed you coded inequity. So the question might be, what does coded justice look like? How do we use these tools and embed different values into them? So hopefully, most or all of you know the tragic story of Breonna Taylor that came to light in the early weeks of the pandemic. If you don't, then you'll get a sense of it through the video clip. But that context, I think, is important to know to understand what makes this such an important intervention. So here I go.
Breonna's garden started out as a need or a desire to want to provide a safe place for Janiyah Palmer, who's the younger sister of Breonna Taylor. I wanted a way for her to feel safe, in a world where people were saying very disparaging things about her sister, someone who's a role model, her hero, right? And so in this garden setting, we provide the ability to silence a lot of the noise and focus on the clear signal of healing, of reconciliation, of honoring someone's life, honoring the connection. I'm Lady Phoenix. I'm an artist, I'm a curator, and I'm an art advisor. I wanted to engage Janiyah in a, kind of hands-off way. Just started following her on Instagram, wanting to understand her story, wanting to understand who Breonna really is and was to her and her family and her community. And in doing so, I was very touched by everything Janiyah was sharing. I phoned up my buddy Sutu, who's a legendary AR/VR artist, and I said, hey, I have this idea. Are you interested? He said yes straight away. Loved the idea, and we began working. That was in the summer of 2020. When we initially approached Janiyah, at first she was like, this is cute, this is cool, thank you for doing this, I'm not interested. He was like, well, I get approached all the time, and it actually never really is about Breonna, or they never follow through. I said, okay, no problem. And I kept working, and kept observing, and remained a part of her online community. And then I came back and I said, we have something for you to actually look at. It's not just like a deck. We have something for you to interact with. What do you think? And then she messaged me back and she was like, oh my God, I love it. I'm crying. I showed my mom, she's crying. This is beautiful. Yes. I think she felt seen. I wanted to give Janaya a choice, ultimately. Sure, the world is saying what they're saying about your sister. You know, your family knows, that's absolutely false. They didn't know her, right? They're simply trying to get a rise out of people and selling the hour. How about we come into a reality where who Brianna was to you, who she is to you, can be the core of why people gather. Love can be the focus. What's horrible and traumatic is known, but the unknown is the beauty, is the joy, is the wonder. And to be in a place that's not only held for that possibility to continue to flourish, but also the possibility of complete strangers coming into the garden, planting their own flowers through their own memory of their loved one. People who are drawn to this project are drawn because of the healing nature of the project and because of the beauty nature of the project. It's actually quite beautiful to be held by butterflies and hummingbirds and, you know, all manner of life and colorful flowers and bees. You know, literally life is attracted to this place. Whether it be in the digital sense or in the physical sense, we're creating a bridge where people can move closer to that beauty within them and move closer to that healing within them. It's something that we as a humanity, especially in COVID, when people couldn't even bury their loved ones, I think it's a solution, an important solution, that allows us to keep living and keep loving and keep remembering and keep sharing and keep coming together around things that are important and that are precious, which is life.
So when I first had a chance to meet Janaya and Kenny to discuss the project, they described it as a way to rewrite Brianna's story, scratching the contemptuous media speculation that she was responsible for her own death, and scripting a digital coda that extended her passion for nursing to collective healing. Brianna's garden was designed to be a digital public space, unlike social media where hate and contaminates any love and support that might be spread. The app also provides a way for people to connect with others in honoring their own deceased loved ones, because the messages in the garden can be for anyone, not just Brianna. But even more than the technical innovations, which are many, what impressed me was the care and collaboration that went into the design. Lady Fee was very intentional in centering Brianna's family. The family, in turn, continues to seek justice in the courts, and they've been using the garden to raise awareness about Brianna's case. Lady Fee, in turn, encourages those of us who experience it, and we can download it right now, to expand our imaginations of justice, to include the work of repair and healing. She draws upon the work of Mia Mingus and others that describe transformative justice as a way to make things right, getting in right relation, or creating justice together. This view of justice doesn't just happen in the courts, if it happens there at all, but in community with others, even those digital communities like Brianna's Garden, where people can gather and grieve, heal, and organize. So in closing, I want to leave you with one last proposition. If inequity is woven into the very fabric of our society, that means we see it from policing to preschool, to healthcare, to work, then perhaps each twist, coil, and code is a chance for us to weave new patterns, practices, politics. That is to say, the vastness of the things that we're up against will be their undoing once we accept that we are pattern makers, that we don't just have to carry on the patterns of old, the things we've inherited. But when we look into the fine print, when we go beyond the buzzwords and the platitudes, then I think that we can create something different together. With that, I'm going to close my talk and open it up to you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ruha. We have half an hour for questions. People need to leave now. Please do. We have 2 mics set up here, and we would like people to line up to ask questions. I've told my students, our students, they get priority. This was designed, this lecture was staged to be part of several classes, and so I want to give students priority in asking questions. Since this is being live streamed and recorded, I really do want you to come up to the mics. I'm looking at you. And yeah, so I think now's the time. I know it's a little bit intimidating. We could try passing the mic around to you, but okay, the mics are live. It's so powerful. I think we all just need to exhale.
I usually ask people just to share with their neighbor something that is stuck with them, an image, a phrase, before we open things up, just to get it out. Yeah.
Thank you.
Go for it.
Yeah, I'm Alex.
Hey.
I'm a freshman as well. I found your idea with, this was earlier on in the talk, and great talk, by the way. There was a lot of fascinating points that were brought up. I found your idea with the distinction between deadly data and do-good data very intriguing. And my question is specifically with regard to the internet, because that's what fuels many of the large language models and AI tools that we see throughout our daily lives today.
Yeah.
How are we able to characterize the difference between do-good data and deadly data in the internet? And what sort of choices can I make as a computer science student to focus on bringing out that do-good data and really emphasize that in my work?
Yeah, I love that question. First of all, kudos to you. First year, popping off the questions. I want to say, you know, that's awesome. And you know, I think in my use of those phrases, I'm thinking of them less as true characterizations of the data and more in the way that they're presented to us and packaged, like when we think in hindsight or think about, you know, these different projects as do-gooding. And I would say when it comes to the internet, that oftentimes the issue is that it's all mixed up, right? It's very hard to make these ideal types, as Weber would say, and say it's one thing or another. But I would say as a student and someone who's perhaps going into these fields, your assessment of what this data is going to do, evil or good, is not strictly about analyzing the data itself, but zooming out and thinking about the context of its production and then how it's going to be used in the world. Because I do have colleagues who their analysis of the internet, they shine a light on the way that it has been instrumental for creating new communities, for forging different movements and organizing. So they're looking at the way that people have used these tools, even though perhaps that wasn't the intention of their creators, that they've been wielded in a way that, at least in the work that I'm thinking of, assesses it as something that is generating stronger social ties and letting voices be heard that haven't been. And so, again, it's not a cookie cutter thing where we can just say, let's put this lens and let's decide. We have to think about the context, because I think the very same tools, data, platforms, at one moment that could be doing a lot of harm, they can perhaps be repurposed in some. But oftentimes, I think it goes the other way around. Like we're looking at the devolution of Twitter, X right now. And so I have the same colleagues I'm thinking of have looked at the way that hashtag activism was a part of so many different both domestic and global movements for justice, and how in the hands of one new owner that the possibilities have become severely constricted. So that's a long-winded way of saying that going forward, don't be confident in your own ability to assess the data as good or bad, thinking about the context and including people who are potentially harmed by whatever tool you're working on or you're helping to redesign, including them as part of the assessment, I think is really important to see what you are not seeing, right? Yeah. And there are rubrics, there are ways that you can sort of bring in prior knowledge as part of that process. A lot of the text that I teach in that class I mentioned yesterday is trying to do just that. That is, there's a book called Data Feminism that is really excellent at providing ways of assessing. There's a book called Design Justice that is excellent again. And then there's things that are just like a sets of questions that you could ask about any technology to help to start assessing what its possibilities are. And a lot of those questions have to do with how it's produced, not just what it does, but like who's behind the scenes, like what are the interests that are driving its creation. And so if you can't find the links to some of these, I'll tweet them out afterwards. But there's a lot of great material that I think is, a lot of it just developed in the last 10 years that I draw on, but much, kind of older work that I think individuals and then teams can use in their design process.
Thank you so much.
No, my thank you. Hi.
Hi. Oh, geez. Thank you for a fantastic talk. I have a kind of science pedagogy question. I'm a grad student in the psych department, and I'm gearing up to TA for a research methods class. And one of the main things that we're supposed to highlight is that if you're trying to study a phenomenon of interest, you need to control for as many other variables as possible to get rid of variance from other ways. And that feels kind of at odds with the ethos of considering social and historical evidence that are shaping cognition and patterns of behavior. So how do you find that balance between scientific control and social history, and how would you convey that in a research methods context?
Thank you for that. It actually relates to this short book review that I did. The book was called Racecraft. And so if you go to the research tab of my website, you can see my review of it, because it speaks to this idea, for example, applying it to the way that social scientists often think that we can control for social variables like race. We treat race as dependent rather than thinking about how it shapes everything, And so it kind of turns it on its head and says, let's, rather than thinking that we can control for these things, actually build it, understand the context in which it's then creating all of these effects. And so it's been probably 6 or 7 years now, so the different stages of that argument is not coming to mind. But if you just go look up Racecraft, the review, I think you can apply that to other contexts and other ways of thinking about the things that we're meant to control. And I think there's a place for that. But in the analysis that I'm offering here, I do think that it often limits the scope of what we're trying to get at, right? And so, yeah, hopefully that essay will be useful to you. Good luck.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for an amazing lecture. My name's Arturo. I'm a senior applied mathematics major, and I'm from Panama City, Panama. And that's what motivates my question, which is, I have seen and read once and many times again about the cost of inclusive modeling, about how costly it is to generate enough data of diverse individuals so that the model can serve them appropriately. This rings true to me, but my first question is this true? This rings true because insofar as English theory and English outlook cannot understand me when I speak and I cannot use dictation, I think that if a company that large cannot make it happen, it probably is true. And then if that is true, and we move into the countries that are already behind in data, that have a priority to move forward, but probably not the funds to invest in this, it is very clear that there are ways to assess data and assess models. But how do we deal with the decision making? How do we deal with the trade-offs? For example, if we're confronted with expediting a passport process, and we know that the data is not enough for Black women to not be considered in violation of the picture guidelines for having an open mouth like it happened in Britain, do we move forward with it or do we stay behind? And how exactly can we make it more affordable for countries to build these inclusive models moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, such layered questions, and I think there's a few things that come to mind. One, in some ways, there's an answer in there about how priorities are set. And I often am suspicious of when things are said that this is not possible because of whatever, funds or what have you, because it's decisions that are being made to invest in some things and not other things. So part of it is to begin to just question how priorities set, who's setting them, and to think about what's behind that process. But I think the end of your reflection brings us to this growing arena of what public interest technology development should and can be. Because the we in the sets of questions that you pose, I think we have to ask, who is the we behind this that are setting these priorities, that are deciding we can't focus on this language, we have to do this? And so part of it is to bring those questions into a more public fora, so they're not decided behind closed doors where often the profit incentive and shareholders are the we and not the public that is being impacted by this. So it's not a direct question like we have to do this X, Y, and Z, but it's what context do we create so that we in your questions, it actually reflects a broader humanity rather than the interests of shareholders that are driving a lot of the decision making, which, as one of my colleagues says, one way to think about the state that we're in is that we have public policy decisions being made in private by people who were not elected, right? Because of the way these tools are impacting so many areas of our lives. And so to me, your questions are a case for thinking seriously about developing public interest technology where this is a more democratic process.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi.
Hello, my name is Jake. I'm a junior.
Hi, Jake.
A CS major. Well, I wrote it down so don't forget it.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier how hundreds of universities have adapted success predictors and how it was really discriminatory towards black students. There's a 4 times rate of them dropping out in the prediction. And my question is just your comment on rating departments and fields. Yeah. Do you mean in terms of their general success, their success with different groups of people, or their racial and gender bias in general? And just can you elaborate on how you think this could be incorporated in an effective and meaningful way?
Yeah, thank you. And I should be careful what I propose as sort of tongue-in-cheek, because people will actually be like, okay, let me see how I can create that. And so part of me, that was a kind of rhetorical proposition, if we're gonna do this, let's focus on those in power, but taking seriously, what if we actually created this? And there is a parody example that I have in mind that might be something that we can model it after, called the white-collar early warning system, which takes this idea of predictive policing that's usually targeting low-income communities of color, and there's a heat mapping, you can go and look it up, a heat mapping platform where you can put in different cities and see where the likelihood of white-collar crime's happening, so you can be careful when you go into those areas. So it takes this thing that's actually been weaponized against communities and say, what if we turn it on those in power? What would that look like? And you can actually download that app and use it when you go to different locales. Taking that seriously in the context of universities, we might ask a whole sets of questions about what is meaningful for us? What do we think are the environments that departments, fields should be offering that they're not currently, that make it hostile, that push students out? So part of it is identifying the problem and say, what are the factors or the variables that is creating this, and then how might we measure it? But behind that, and that's why I say it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, then we have to ask ourselves, is measuring that and calculating that, the riskiness of departments, how is that actually going to affect the environment? Is it actually going to produce the effect that we want, right? Which is, let's say, more welcoming, cultivating spaces that foster the potential of every student. So I'm saying I can help you and others figure out how to create the corollary of the white-collar early warning system, but I still have I have kind of cynicism around whether this tool that would create these calculations, let's say I have sons that are in college, that me looking up, okay, is this department high risk or low risk for someone of his demographic? how would that actually affect the environment? How would people actually use this? And so I would want us to talk about that as part of the design process.
And how would you define risk in that context again?
So risk, again, thinking about, let's say, talking to students, I would first probably survey students and say, what makes this a good department for you? What makes this a department that either you got pushed out of or that you feel like you can't do your best work? So I would take those survey results. I wouldn't try to decide myself. And then I would use that as a way to determine, okay, now these are the factors that keep coming up, and this makes it a hostile environment or a risky environment for the students in this field, right? So I think any good instrument should include the users or the people who are actually experiencing it and build their insights into the design process. Does that help?
Thank you,
Yeah, sure.
Hi. Colleges and universities have computer science departments that have undergrads and graduate students who are emerging computer scientists or aspirational entrepreneurs. And I'm wondering what your assessment is of how well they are teaching ethics, if at all, alongside the technical expertise that these computer scientists or researchers or entrepreneurs will need.
Yeah, that's an excellent thesis project to kind of do this audit. I don't personally can't tell you, kind of give you that survey, because all of my insights come from the students that I've interacted with in the few departments that I know. I'll just give you an anecdote. Again, going back to the class that I taught yesterday, which is cross-listed engineering and African American studies, the first class at Princeton with that cross-list. So I have a really great mix of students. And one of the themes that came up in the discussion was students who were in a COAST class. They were saying that their class the previous day, they were basically getting pitched this idea this is how you can become a billionaire. They had a guest speaker and it was all this kind of entrepreneurial, this is a get-rich scheme. And they were questioning the ethos behind not just that lesson, but this track, this one of 3 tracks out of the university. And so again, I think my own assessment is I can't tell you how many places are doing ethics. I think in my view, in the last 5 to 10 years, it's become imperative for most places to at least show some nod to these issues, whether it's a guest speaker, a module. I think some places are doing it more substantively, some more superficially, and we could probably create a spectrum doing some kind of survey along those lines to say, who's just, where's this just lip service and cosmetic, and where is this actually being integrated into the curriculum? And by that, the way that I think about a more substantive approach, it's where the ethics aren't an add-on to this is the important technical, and then let's have a week of ethics that somehow is separate, that you can treat as separate, rather than thinking about the ethics of all of that stuff that we've been doing. So a more integrated approach to me doesn't just add it on, tag it on at the end or at the beginning or drops it in as a guest speaker, but it thinks about how it gets us to ask different questions. And so in my view, setting us off on a more ethical sort of pathway is about our starting questions. It's not about even the data set. I talked about the data nutrition. It's because the question determines what data you go looking for in the first place, right? So whose perspective are the questions being asked from, to what ends, et cetera, and that sets us off down some rabbit holes and others. So it's about becoming much more, I think, rigorous in the early part of the process rather than tagging things on at the end.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, no, you're next.
Hi, I'm Reedy. I'm also a freshman. And my question kind of comes from your book. Yeah. You discuss how there's often a misconception that marginalized or minority populations don't necessarily use the internet as much, when with regards to that, oftentimes they are using it. And you also discuss how third world countries in Africa or in India are experiencing this leapfrogging effect when it comes to cyber innovation. My question kind of comes with regards to that. I definitely have observed that in my motherland itself. And I mean, it's scary, and this notion of users being used is really, really scary. What do we do with regards to, what can I do to protect my family? Or as I'm going moving further in engineering or becoming a pattern maker and building new systems and dismantling old ones, like what do I do to make sure that the people who don't have the privilege of being in this room are able to be protected against the adverse effects of these sorts of issues?
Yeah, I love that question. There's so much that we can do, but most of the things are not things that we are just doing as individuals and making sort of individual choices about our data use or our internet use. I think to the first part of your question, I think this is a really important starting point for taking us down one pathway or another, where you said it's not simply about access to technologies. Because a decade or two ago, if we said we're doing a lecture or a session on race and technology, it would be about the lack of access to tablets, to broadband, which are all important. And we saw that really come to light at the beginning of COVID, where when schools went remote, we had hundreds of thousands of students in many places that couldn't get basic access to their teachers, et cetera. But to limit the conversation about equity and technology just to access is really to narrow the scope. So first, to just acknowledge that you picking up on that theme is crucial to setting us down a different sort of set of issues. But to what to do. I mentioned a number of organizations, and what I think is, you know, as a student, you're a student, but you're also a citizen. You're a person in the world that has a say, that has power. And I think thinking about how, even if it's just a little bit of time now that grows over the course of your studies and then work, is to think about how you can lend your time and energy to supporting the organizing work of, let's say, the Internet Freedom Foundation in India, let's say, or the Detroit Community Technology Project if you're from Michigan, or finding the place in your own locale right, you know, here to think about, okay, how can I support this work, right? Because so many of these organizations are trying to be sort of umbrellas and bring people together, and to have the energy, the time, the know-how to do some of this work, I think is important. And so that's a long way of saying that often the way that we can help those we love most, some of those things are direct, but part of it is thinking about what is the world that they have to live in, and how can I begin to seed changes in that world? And that might be a more indirect route by lending your energies to some of these initiatives and groups that I'm describing.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Hi, I'm Sire. I'm a CSN math major, and I'm really interested in AI and also how to make it better. So my question is about the recent excitement that we have had in the field of AI, and including with ChatGPT as the main. So basically, the question is about self-supervised learning, or also called unsupervised learning. So the paradigm as in AI as it used to be was that data comes with labels which are made by humans.
Yeah.
And when we talked about bias, it was about, oh, who is labeling the data and the bias that comes with it.
Yeah.
But recently, all the models that we have are trained via what's called self-supervised learning, which is you learn from the data without any labels. You basically obscure parts of data and then have the bot try to fill it in and get better at it.
Yeah.
That's how ChatGPT is trained. That's how a lot of other models are trained.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about your point about computational context versus cultural and historical context, which is inbuilt into the data that we are training with without any output of any humans, and how we could deal with using such large corpus of data that is available to us to make such powerful tools, besides just not using what we don't understand, because there is uses to what we still don't fully understand. So basically, I wanted you to talk about some things like explainable AI, such as Shapley values, things like that, seeing how a system makes a prediction rather than what prediction it makes. Also, basic alignment research and what your opinion is on that, and also what your opinion is on using unsupervised or supervised learning, because they come with different flavors of biases.
Yeah, first of all, that's such a great primer that you distilled for anyone who didn't know about those distinctions. So your teaching chops are excellent. So to the question, you know, we can apply, I think the way that I think about it is like, how should we be thinking differently, bringing these concerns to this newest iteration, these emerging tools? And so here are a few concerns or ways that we can begin to think about what we might call the spikes in generative AI. some of which have to do with the outputs, like you're describing, what the bias outputs would be. And I think, I think those are most closely related to supervised learning, right? When we think about, okay, if we, ask, show us people who are nurses and you get all women, et cetera, like those predictable types of gender racial biases. And then there are what in higher ed people have been really concerned about, the top line here, which is just like fake news, facts, fabricated citations, those types of things that we can think about as problems that these tools are creating. But then, and which is where I was trying to push us in the talk, is a thing not just about the outputs that we want to wrestle with, but what's going into them, what's behind the scenes, thinking about data privacy issues. I think I just got a memo from my university that said, none of Princeton student or faculty data is going to be used to train generative AI. Like somehow they're going to create a firewall. So they're like trying to address this idea of privacy. But then, so that's, again, I think it's more on our public consciousness because we have this language about the rights around privacy that then gets applied to this. But, and here's where I'm trying to encourage us to also think about who's creating this. That is, one of my colleagues, Lily Irani, says artificial intelligence is actually artificial intelligence. That is, there are humans actually helping to create this. It might not be supervised in the same way as those earlier systems, but we think about the recent issues with laborers in Kenya, click workers in different countries where this work is being outsourced to clean, to detoxify, to create the illusion of self-generated text, images, et cetera. So I think we have to take seriously, if we're going to have a social historical analysis of these tools, is to think about who are the humans that are still helping to create this and getting erased and getting paid a couple dollars an hour around the world. And just yesterday, I came across, I think it was a Wired piece that was talking about prisoners who are code workers. And so in this context, the article was framing it as a positive kind of labor in this prison context in Europe. But a lot of the people who were reading and commenting were just thinking about how this then gets extrapolated, et cetera. So thinking about the potential of this cheap labor to produce all of these fancy tools that then we apply. The last impact, and I would say these four are actually ones that my own university already lists as, professors, think about this if you're going to use these tools in your classrooms. These are things you should be thinking about. And I call them spikes. They don't call them spikes, but they just call them concerns. The last one that they don't mention that I think we should all be thinking about are the environmental impacts of training a single algorithm, much less, looking at cat videos and other things. So again, I think in some ways each layer gets more and more hidden. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that the top layer is what I think is most clearly we can kind of inherit from our previous debates and conversation around supervised learning. But I think what we have now, we have to think even more seriously about these deeper layers in terms of our analysis that are purposely sort of buried so that we enjoy the convenience without caring about the planet and the people that make these tools possible.
So there are a couple more student questions, but unfortunately we have 45 minutes with Dr. Benjamin. There's a reception just outside, so you'll have a chance to ask questions one-on-one.
Or you find me.
Yes,
out
so
there.
stick around. But first, I cannot imagine a better way to launch the Right Center. Thank you so much,
My pleasure,
Professor
my honor.
Benjamin.